this video, I want to talk about how you print out your design, how you transfer it onto your fabric, and then also what embroidery flosses you want to use for this design. This is the second video in this Embroidery 101 series, so if you have not seen the first one, I will put the link to it up here, and I highly recommend checking that out first, where I talk about the tools that you'll need, like fabric, needles, and a hoop. As you can see, this I've already cut up. If you download the file from the link I have in the description box below, it will have two versions of the pattern with the stitch symbol guides, and I'll talk about those when we get further into the stitching process. And they are mirror images of each other. This is designed for a needle book, for the cover of a needle book. And you know, I didn't know if you would want this embroidery on the front or this embroidery on the front. And I'm going to choose this one because for some reason I like this one on the front. But what I've done is I have made little squares so that way you can know if you are printing this out at 100%. And you want to print it out at 100%, which is just printing it, in order for the measurements of the other fabric for the needle book to fit. But if you want it bigger, you can make it bigger. If you want it smaller, you can make it smaller. Just make sure that you change the other fabrics accordingly. But again, that will be at the very end of this class. So you can measure your boxes, make sure that you are correct, choose the version you want to stitch, and then you transfer it onto your design. And there are lots of different ways to transfer patterns onto a fabric. The most common ones are using just old-fashioned carbon paper, where you attach this to the bottom of your pattern, you go over it with a pencil on all the lines, and you have the lines on the fabric. This works really well for light fabrics in particular because carbon paper is dark, and it works when you're stitching over all of the lines. That's really important. If you have dark fabric, you can still get graphite paper. You can get white paper that will do the same thing, but it's not quite as effective, but this will work too. So those are ways I use all the time. In fact, I've used this piece already. The nice thing about carbon paper is that you can reuse it. Another option is this sulky stick and stitch. Sulky Fabrisolve is what they call it now. This might be the old name. Sulky has a version, DMC has a version, and essentially it is a water soluble stabilizer paper that you can put in your printer. And you print on the sort of rough side, and then you can cut it out, and it's basically a sticker, and put it on your fabric. And this is really good for dark fabrics because you don't have to worry about coloring on it, but it's also good for complicated designs on light fabrics as well. And I really enjoy using this. I think it's a good method. It has the instructions here, and it washes away, and you don't have to worry about stitching directly on the lines because the lines wash away. Unlike with some of the other methods I'm going to show you, you have to stitch over the lines because the lines are fairly permanent. But this one, the lines are not permanent, so that's very nice. A third way of transferring designs is using a light pad, and I'm sorry for the glare, but this is my light pad here. And that is a good way to, you put the pattern on the light pad, you put your fabric over the pattern, and you trace the pattern through the fabric. And you can use a water soluble pen, which I don't have readily available, but you can buy water soluble pens. You can use a pencil, you can use a friction pen that's heat erasable, and on darker fabric you can actually get a chalk pen that will work really well. These are good options for thin fabric, but for thicker fabric it's harder to see. And this is my normal way of transferring designs. I use this method and carbon paper. Normally when you're stitching, you would have one single design that will be in your hoop the whole time, and then you will stitch the whole thing in the hoop. Unlike in other textile media, you don't usually stitch in embroidery anything outside the hoop. Like you choose an image, you choose a pattern that will fit in the hoop that you have. And so you often will want to actually hoop your fabric and then transfer the design so that it's nice and taut when you transfer it. For this design though, because it's wider and we're going to be working it in two phases, we don't want to do that. If you don't have a light pad, they're fairly inexpensive online, but you can also just tape your fabric to a window. So what I do is I take some masking tape, I tape the pattern to the fabric face up, and then you can tape the whole thing to a window and draw on that as well, and that's another way you can get past this. But I think for today I'm going to use carbon paper, just because it's hard to use a light pad when I have such extreme lighting happening. So let me clean this stuff up and I will get started and show you how I do that. As I mentioned, this is just carbon paper and you can buy a ton of it for really cheap. I think I've been using the same carbon paper for 2 years and I haven't even gone through a quarter of it, and it was not that expensive. So you need carbon paper, you need some tape to make sure it all doesn't move, you need a pen or a stylus in order to put pressure on the carbon paper to put it on the fabric. And that's basically it, and you need your pattern. And I like using a pen because then I can see where I've been. That's really important. So I'm gonna set this up and we can get started. You want to make sure that you are taping the pattern to the non-carbon side and putting it all carbon side down onto the fabric, and then tape it there. Now that this is all attached to itself fairly well, now we can start tracing the design. And I, like I said, like to use a colored pen so I can see where I've been. I'll talk about what each line and symbol means in the next video when we start stitching, when I kind of give a rundown of the stitches that we'll use. But each of these lines, even the dotted lines, are still going to be stitched. So you want to keep that in mind. The only caveat to that are these loops with the lines. Those are lazy daisies. And so what I normally do is I just color in that one line there. That's the tacking down stitch. And that's really the only stitch you can control easily where it's going to sit. So you don't want a big black loop if your stitch isn't going to cover that. And that will be made more clear when we talk about lazy daisies. But for now, I'm just going to trace the straight line, not the loop. I hope that makes sense. So I'm going to speed this up and you can see where I get to. And these large dots are French knots. And so I'm just doing a little dot in them, and here you can see where we are now. That's what it looks like so far. And that way you know that there's supposed to be a dot there. This thick line here is just a group of stitches, so you don't have to kind of color that in. And here we can see again where we are. So here we have our thimble, our tomato with our lazy daisy ticks, and then all that. I'm in a weird position here and I'm on a weird surface, so I'm not able to draw as neatly as I would like, but that's really okay. As long as it's close enough that when you cover it up, it looks nice. That's all that matters. And I do like to check every once in a while just to make sure that I'm on the right track and I haven't forgotten anything, like those French knots. And this is why I use a colored pen, so I know I'm not forgetting anything. Now we can scoot this over. This up here is a satin stitch, so you want to do the whole box. This thick line is the same as the bottom of the thimble, so you want to just do a line. These straight lines here are straight stitches, which I'll talk about later, but you do want to do those straight lines. And that should all be transferred. I outlined both of these dark circles. That is basically going to be filled in with French knots. And I accidentally traced that loop there, but that should be okay. So here is the reveal. And that is a transferred design. It doesn't look like much now, but it'll be great when we're stitching. It'll be very easy to figure out when we're stitching. You do need the pattern, and you want to take it off of your carbon paper because this tells you what stitches to use. Or you can just use the digital version, and that works too. There are two other ways of transferring designs that I don't have the, materials for to show you. The first one involves an inkjet printer. So if you have an inkjet printer and you have an image that fits on an 8.5 by 11 size paper or an A4 size paper, which is kind of standard letter size paper, you can buy something called freezer paper. They sell it in craft stores too, but it's just freezer paper. And all it is like a paper on one side and then like a plasticky shiny on the other side. All you have to do is iron that to the fabric, trim it off so that it's the correct size for the printer, and then you can actually print on fabric. And you can print whatever you want on the fabric. It probably won't stand washings, but if you're embroidering over it, that's perfectly fine. So going through your inkjet printer is another way, and if anyone's interested in seeing how that works, I'm happy to do a quick tutorial in the next couple months. The second way is if you happen to have a cutting machine like a Cricut or a Silhouette or a Brother, they also do sketching. I have a Silhouette machine, and what they have are these pen adapters. And so what I do is I take a friction pen and I use it to sketch the design. And so I do all this. I create a PNG image of what I want to sketch. And I use a program called Inkscape, which is free. And I don't know if it's open source, but it is free. I use Inkscape to sketch the design, and then I export it as a PNG file, and I send it to my cutter as a not cut image. And I use a friction pen to sketch it on. And I have a series that I'm working on of TV sleuths. And so I just did this one today. This is Jessica Fletcher. And a couple things about this is that it will do a double line, like it's cutting out around the line. I'm not willing to pay extra for the Silhouette, plan, like a professional plan where I can import SVG files. So I just try to make the line as thin as possible, and it works fine. And because I'm stitching over the lines, it doesn't matter. But this is another way that you can transfer designs onto fabric. And this is kind of my go-to way at the moment if the design isn't too complicated. If the design's really complicated, my program just can't handle it. So I do have to do some things by hand. But for stuff like this, it's fantastic. So there are any number of ways that you can transfer designs onto fabric. Some of them are low tech, some of them are high tech, but they're all effective and they're all useful in their own way. So basically what you have to do is come up with the way that you like the best, and the sky's the limit with what you can embroider. Okay, let's talk thread. I have a list of the colors that I used down below. They are all DMC, but in essence, to make this needlebook, you need one red, 2 greens, a silver, a gold, a blue, and 2 pinks. And that's it. You can do any brand of floss that you want. I chose DMC because the colors are consistent and it's readily available where I live. I know some people who live in other countries don't have access to DMC very easily. And so you can use anchor floss, you can use independent hand-dyed floss, you can use any kind of floss that you want. There is a caveat to this, use whatever floss you want, and that's basically that you do get what you pay for, and a good quality embroidery floss will not less, it'll be much more enjoyable to work with than a cheap embroidery floss. So a popular brand, like I said, is DMC, but I wouldn't go much cheaper than that in a project that you want to enjoy stitching and that you want to enjoy when it's stitched. And if you want, you can do this in monochrome. So here I've done, this is my test stitch where I did this in white on black, and there are some changes to the final pattern since making this, but you can see where I'm going here. A monochrome on a black looks really good, and I think a monochrome on a white would look really good too, with maybe a variegated floss or, whatever you have around. Throughout this whole project, I'm using 2 strands of floss, and here is just a piece of black floss. This is how it comes in this sort of thick 6-stranded piece. And if you kind of tap on the end, you can hopefully see that there are multiple strands. And the easiest way to get one strand is to kind of tap the end and separate them. And then pull on one strand only. And this will kind of loop up at the back, and then you get one strand. And I recommend separating the strands one at a time and then putting them back together when you thread them. So this uses 2 strands of floss in various ways. 3 strands of floss would also work for this. It just felt a little bit bulky, in particular in the scissors. That felt bulky with 3 strands when I did it, but you can certainly do it in 3 strands. Once you've chosen your floss, one thing that people have questions about is how you store your floss. And there are lots of different floss storage options. You can buy bobbins at the store, and I will post a picture of bobbins here, and you can buy paper or plastic bobbins. There are big storage systems that you can buy. Some people put them in bags like this. This is just a standard generic little snack bag, but people also buy things called floss away bags and then keep them on rings. I like keeping them on floss tags. And this is a set of floss tags that my friend Francine made me, and they're absolutely gorgeous. And I think I'm going to use them for this project along with a couple other ones. But you can make your own too. So this is just I think it's a card I got, or a box. I save boxes or food containers if they haven't touched food. If there's like a bag inside the box, I'll save the box if it has a good image or if it's a nice color or something. And I have a circle punch, and then this is just a regular punch, and then a smaller punch, and I just punch holes in them. You can also use business cards or clothing tags, or any kind of cardboard. I like this because it's recycling as well. I like this because it's gorgeous. I'm going to show with DMC because, again, that's what's readily available, and that's what this pattern is charted in. A couple tips about DMC. As I showed you before, it is 6-stranded, and in order to get it off the skein, this is called a skein, by the way. This is a skein of embroidery floss. And in order to get it off the skein, you want to find the end that is by the large tag with the number on it. So DMC has 2 tags. It has a small tag with the company, and then it has a larger tag with the number and the barcode. You want to take from this side. And essentially, if you pull from this side, it almost never knots up. And if it does knot up, you can undo it fairly easily. In order to get it so it's ready to be on a floss tag, I take something to wrap it around. Now, I actually have purposely made floss winders because I'm a little bit extra and they're beautiful wood. Let me show you one. This is a long one. This is an 18-inch one, and it is made by R&R Woodworks KY, meaning Kentucky, and it's 18 inches long, so I'm not going to be able to show you the whole thing in my setup here. I also have a 9-inch one and a 12-inch one. The 12-inch one is my favorite because I like my strands to be 24 inches. It's kind of a sweet spot for me. So basically you wrap it around this and you cut it in the middle. But if you don't have one of these, that's fine. You can just take cardboard. So I'm just going to show you again, the setup here is weird for this. If you pull from this end, it just unwinds. And eventually they fly off because it's too small. And then you just take the end and finish it up. And you take your scissors, run it under, and cut them. And you have even lengths of floss. And to use the floss tag, you stick it through, grab it through the loop, and make a little knot. I think this is called a goose head knot. If it's not, I'll put the correct term down here. It's a pretty basic knot. And the nice thing about this is that I mentioned that this is being stitched in 2 strands. And normally you would have to, if you're on a bobbin, you'd have to unwind it off the bobbin and cut your length and pull off the threads and then wind it back on. But with this one, you can take a needle, grab one strand gently and just pull one strand out, and the rest is perfect. So that's why I like these so much. And I actually have a hanging system. If you watch my first video, you see how I store my flosses behind me on that pegboard. So I store them hanging up. And this is good because I have a project bag for each project, and I can just put the entire thing in the project bag. So those are some tips and tricks on how I store my flosses, how I use them, and how I cut them, and also how to get them off the skein. That's how you transfer the design and the flosses that you'll need for this project. You do not need a lot of any color for this project. So this is a great scrap buster if you're feeling like you have random colors lying around, because of course you can have this floss be any color you want. You can have these flowers be any color you want. You can have the scissors, you can have any of it be any color you want. These are just the colors that I chose. So in the next video, we're going to talk about how you hoop your fabric, how you thread your needle, how you start and end your stitching, and we're going to learn the back stitch. But until then, thank you so much for watching. Please take good care of yourselves and have a good one. Bye.